Well guys, this has been a pretty long journey so far, and here at the series midpoint, we find the game that changed everything for this long-running franchise. Not satisfied with the direction RE was going in, director Shinji Mikami, in a bout of absolute psychosis, decided that the switch to Nintendo's newest platform, the Gamecube, would be the perfect time to drop all pretenses of survival horror and go with the straight-up action game he had been trying to create since Part 2. With a renewed creative energy and a hammer forged from ridiculous amounts of hype, Mikami proceeded to drive the last nails into the survival horror coffin. Yes people, today we are taking a look at the mold from which all other RE games would be formed. A game that fractured a fan base and altered video games as we know them. Now whether or not this was a good thing? Well, I guess we'll just have to find out. What's up everybody, I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews, welcoming you to part 4 of the Resident Evil Retrospective. RE4 started its life in the early 2000s, and much like almost every RE game up to this point, suffered some major setbacks along the way. Throughout the game's creation, it went through not one, but two completely scrapped builds. The first was an attempt at a stylish action game and an emphasis on fast-paced combat. This build dropped the series' iconic pre-rendered backgrounds along with, well, really everything else Resident Evil was known for. At this point, things were so far off the rails that even Mikami thought it was too much of a departure. But instead of tearing it down and starting over, series regular Hideki Kamiya decided this would be its own standalone release known as Devil May Cry. With all of their hard work now tied up in a brand new IP, the development team, now working under Hiroshi Shibata, started from scratch and created a new scenario that saw Leon Kennedy infiltrating Umbrella headquarters and getting infected with the progenitor virus. This build was labeled the Fog version and was a little closer to a traditional RE game. In fact, it included classic enemies like zombies, and if the trailer is anything to go off of, classic fixed camera angles too. Around the 40% mark, this build was scrapped for a completely new story and gameplay style. This would commonly be known as the Hookman version and introduced a lot of ideas that would survive the transition to the final release. This build included the familiar over-the-shoulder perspective and the inclusion of QuickTime events. Taking a more supernatural approach, this attempt had Leon facing off against possessed toys and suits of armor moving around on their own. And of course we can't forget the titular Hookman, who appeared to be some type of ghost. I feel like this would have been a bad fit for the series, and unlike the unreleased 1.5, I'm kinda glad it never saw the light of day. After this phase, there was yet another shift dubbed the Hallucination version, but this was more of a story and setting change than a full restart. This build was also shut down as it was deemed to have been too expensive to produce. After this, there was an attempt at a more traditional RE game, which was scrapped due to it being too formulaic. And finally, after covering the most fucked up development timeline so far in the retrospective, we've come to
Resident Evil 4.
And the worst title announcer in series history. Really, Capcom? Come on, you used to know how to do these things right.
Resident Evil 2.
Anyways, RE4 starts out by cutting ties with half of the established series lore. It seems that Leon Kennedy, having survived the T-virus outbreak and subsequent nuking of Raccoon City, had been scouted for a Secret Service job protecting the president's family. After his daughter is kidnapped by some radical cult, the president sends Leon to Spain, and that's where our story picks up. After about 1 full minute of gameplay, it's clear that Mikami was really jazzed about finally breaking out of the series mold. Yeah sure, why not kick us while we're down, you fucking sadistic bastard. On a personal note, I think I might finally understand how Devil May Cry fans felt after DMC. But I digress. The rescuing of a damsel in distress soon turns into a bit of intrigue when we find that this cult has access to some type of ancient microparasite known as Las Plagas, and all of its members have had their bodies and minds hijacked by it. As far as stories go, this really isn't a bad justification to get Leon in numerous ridiculously contrived situations with the parasitic hive mind. The rescuing of the president's daughter is about as campy as it sounds, but it's played straight here, and I can at least give the game credit for that. And this is where I have to put my foot down. For some reason, the fedora-clad uber dorks that make up games media are always praising RE4 on its tongue-in-cheek humor and premise, and for the life of me, I've never understood why. Listen people, there is literally no difference between this.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
And this.
Here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
4 is not some type of hipster bastion for ironic comedy. It's a game with poor jokes written by people unfamiliar with the concept of English humor, just like every other Resident Evil game in the series. Please stop looking for ways to justify loving every aspect of this game. It's a little sad, okay? Alright, moving on. Surprisingly, the most poorly executed parts of this story all stem from having very minute elements of Resident Evil shoehorned in. I mean, take the general idea of a special agent rescuing a VIP from an evil cult under the control of an invasion of the body snatchers type of parasite. Maybe not the most nuanced tale ever told, but it's clean and it fits the game world. The parts of the story that are supposed to tie it to the larger Resident Evil lore feel unimportant and sometimes just lazy. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like that they included the fact that Umbrella was shut down when the facts of the Raccoon City incident leaked, and it's cool to see 2 familiar characters meeting up again, but this stuff accounts for less than 10% of the story. The Umbrella Corp gets mentioned a whopping 3 times, and only 2 of those times are actually verbal. As for the history between Ada and Leon, well, that really only exists if you've played Part 2. My point being, if this stuff is so inconsequential to the game's story, why the hell was it included? Now, I know what you're thinking, but hear me out. Close your eyes and think of everything you know about RE4's story. Now imagine the microscopic amount in there that calls back to the previous games in the series. Alright, you with me so far? Okay, now imagine that tiny little bit wasn't there. Is it that radically different of a story? Trust me, this is a theme we'll be revisiting in the video in a lot more detail. So in the spirit of brevity, let's move on to gameplay. Now, any of you watching this, regardless of your experience with the original games, are likely to recognize this setup. RE4 may have been praised more than any other game in recent memory, and as we just found out, it wasn't for the Oscar-worthy plotline. This constant over-the-shoulder perspective / camera angle, whether you like it or not, revolutionized third-person shooting and made it what it is today. This close-up angle does a couple of things very well. First, and most obviously, it keeps a sense of tension in combat. Much like the original Resident Evil games hiding enemies behind cinematic camera angles, RE4 uses its limited field of view to keep you on your toes. This mixed with a relatively slow turn speed makes for a nice little panic attack when you hear a hoarse voice behind you cursing in Spanish. It also makes crowd control more essential, and since we've touched on that, let's talk about the game's new addition to the bestiary, or more importantly, what it's missing. Nowhere in this game will you find a single zombie. Yes, the main reason for the franchise's existence are absent here, which sucks, but also kind of makes sense in a weird way. In place of the Walking Dead or the Ganados, people who have been taken over by the Las Plagas parasite and are now just a walking flesh puppet for the gross alien-looking thing growing inside them. Since these maintain some semblance of mental faculties, it's not uncommon to see them wielding bats, knives, chainsaws, crossbows, or complicated mining equipment. The addition of smarter enemies that can climb ladders, open doors, swing swords, and generally just mess your shit right up would have been a terrible idea when the series was still rocking tank controls and fixed camera angles. But the radical change in perspective seen here is actually pretty geniusly pulled off. While walking around, you'll notice that Leon is always just a bit off-center. This gives you a good amount of screen real estate unobstructed by your character, which in turn works perfectly with the uncomfortably close-up position the camera takes. The intersection of these two seemingly unimportant mechanics allowed Mikami to maintain a bit of the tension that came with the old, limited perspectives, while ramping up things like enemy speed and aggressiveness. When aiming, the camera zooms in and keeps Leon in the very bottom left-hand corner. As a fan of immersion, I have to say, keeping your character on screen while going into this zoomed-in aiming mode helps lessen the disconnect between me and what's happening on screen. And continuing on this point, let's talk about the simplistic genius that is this laser sight. In most shooters, you can expect to see an aiming reticle on screen at all times. Without this, players would have no idea what they're shooting at, but never before has it been so perfectly worked into the game world. The laser sight in RE4 not only makes for some staggeringly accurate shooting, but it also feels like a part of the game's world, and less a part of the game, if that makes any sense. The only real issue with this style of aiming is how awkward it can be at really close ranges, which I'll be honest is more than likely due to the angle of the gun and it being held in the very bottom left corner of the screen. The good news is, this is a very small annoyance and is easily made up for by the immersion factor. And since we're on the topic of immersion, let's talk about the other thing that this game made a household name. RE4 uses a ridiculous amount of QuickTime events, which, now that I think about it, sounds weird saying since I don't think we even had a name for these things back then. Whether it's running from a boulder, ripping off your own Hollywood movie, or just shaking a bad guy off you, expect to be mashing some combination of buttons at some point most of the time. And this is where I surprise no one by saying that I've never really been a fan of these things. Not sure why, but they've just never clicked with me. That being said, the QTEs in this game are actually pretty fun. I haven't decided yet if this is due to them being good on their own or just a cheap way to increase my stress factor, but either way, I enjoyed them. Now, some of you that have been with me for years may remember me saying this.
And if that didn't destroy immersion enough, just wait. If there's one thing that ruins a game's dark and scary atmosphere, it's large, colorful button cues.
And yeah, that still stands, even though I actually got a nice sense of satisfaction from narrowly dodging a falling axe with a few frames to spare. Seeing these big, bright button graphics on screen just takes me out of the experience and leaves me wishing there was a way to keep the fun of the QTEs and ditch the oversized, colorful button prompts. Now, if you, like me, aren't too fond of the QuickTime events, the good news is there's not a huge chance you'll notice any one problem with the game, since 4 is about the most disjointed, action-heavy roller coaster ride you've ever seen. In any given hour of gameplay, you could be shooting crowds of ganados, being dragged through a lake by a hauntingly terrifying mutant salamander, expressing your inner Indiana Jones, playing target practice for collectible figurines, and about 200 other types of batshit insanity. Now, I'm aware that this sounds like a complaint, but in reality, I'm kind of impressed. I mean, we've known for a long time Shinji Mikami had been trying to make non-Resident Evil titles, but who knew he was just gonna stuff a decade worth of creative blue balls into one game? Which would definitely explain the runtime. I finished this bad boy in about 15 hours, and compared to the rest of the series, this is damn near unheard of. The good news is all the ups and downs I've been talking about add up to a net positive. Resident Evil 4 is a blast to play most of the time. Sure, there's some issues with pacing when the game decides to drag ass in the middle, and yeah, getting distance on an enemy, quick turning, lining up a headshot, initiating a melee attack, then knifing them to death before they can get up, can be about as formulaic as it sounds, but even this leaves me feeling accomplished. Kinda like I figured out the Matrix and now I'm some kind of unstoppable killing machine. Well, most of the time. I do have one pretty big problem with the game, and that's the insane amount of box breaking you'll need to do. Every single damn area in the game is littered with crates or boxes containing some life-saving ammo or your 50th useless flash grenade. The process of knifing these boxes one or two at a time and collecting their contents over and over and over again gets real annoying real fast. I mean, yeah, I guess I don't technically have to do this, but while this isn't a survival horror game, ammo and healing herbs are still precious commodities, and these boxes are the best places to get them. An increase in items gained from one crate would definitely help decrease the tedium, and it's kinda hard to believe something like this got past playtesters. But to be fair, this game is so fun it actively makes its downside seem less terrible. But who cares? You guys have more than likely already played this game, or at the very least, let modern games journalists tell you how much you like it. Speaking of that, are those guys still bad at video games? Alright, sweet, just checking. Having me screaming into the void that this is actually really fun is a waste of both your and my time. So let's jump into the real good stuff. Resident Evil 4 was a graphical behemoth considering the limited power of its Gamecube origins. I can't really remember a Gamecube game with more impressive real-time lighting, and the volumetric fog was just unheard of. Little effects like exploding heads and dripping drool were grotesquely detailed and equally impressive. Another aspect of this game's look that blew my mind at the time was how far the draw distance was. Now, don't get me wrong, this wasn't exactly an open-world game, but the combination of some really complicated environments and a lack of obscuring fog was an odd combination for a console game of the time. Now, Capcom aren't miracle workers, so of course all this comes with a limit of 30 frames per second, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone complaining about frame rate when there's a graphical marvel to sing the praises of. The footage you've been watching so far has not been from the Gamecube original, but trust me when I say that this game set the standard for console graphics at its time. It would have been easy for Capcom to have tried to save space by pre-rendering all the game's cutscenes, but I'm glad to say they took the opposite route. 99.9% of the game's cinematics are rendered in-engine, which made it age surprisingly well, and makes sure that those of you wanting to upscale the original non-HD releases won't have to worry about any block boundary compression artifacts. That being said, you know I have a couple of raindrops for this parade, and most of them can be summed up by this right here. RE4 goes a little crazy with the button prompts. I mean, these people spent time and money creating a light beam effect for dropped items, but for some reason thought we needed an extra incentive in the form of a big bright graphic on screen to remind us the action button we've been using this entire time performs actions. Luckily, this is about my only complaint with the game's presentation, which now that I think about it is kinda odd for me. Yep, this is an impressive looking game, even judged against today's standards. The original release still holds firm as a tech demo for how far the Gamecube could be pushed, and serves as a rock-solid base for some mixed quality ports. Now, we all know the Resident Evil series is no stranger to a large library of ports, but RE4 is kinda special in the sheer amount of adaptations that have been released. Surprisingly though, most of them aren't worth picking up, which makes my job a little bit easier. The original version was released around 2005 and was supposed to be a GameCube exclusive, but we all know how Capcom treats exclusivity deals. Not even a full year after the ink dried on their agreement with Nintendo, a PS2 port of RE4 was pushed out the door, and this made sense at the time. I mean, the PS2 was the best-selling console by a whopping margin, and Capcom definitely didn't want to leave the room with money still on the table. Sadly, this PS2 version is inferior to the original in almost every single way. Controlling Leon's aim with the PS2's analog stick just feels a bit off, and using the D-pad is not much better of an option. Video quality has also taken a big hit, which paradoxically results in a picture that is both heavily aliased and terribly blurry. Also, the in-engine cutscenes have all been pre-recorded, which means you can expect a big drop down in fidelity there too. I couldn't say whether or not this was due to some shoddy porting or the PS2 just being underpowered, but either way, this is not the version I would recommend to first-timers. On the plus side, there was some additions made, like a new mode that lets you play as Ada for some added story elements, if you like that sort of thing. Next up came the very first PC port, which fans typically call the Ubisoft or 2007 version. This first shot at a PC port was okay, sort of. Obviously, this was the highest resolution option of its day, but it was also very simple up-res, meaning the small blurry textures used in the GameCube original were just stretched to size, and this made for a muddy look on everything that wasn't an animated 3D model. This version also lacks some lighting effects and out-of-the-box mouse support. All of these downsides and its general hard-to-find nature leaves it sitting damn close to the bottom of the list. Later on that same year, we got a very straightforward port of the game to the Wii. This version almost mirrors the GameCube version, but with the addition of motion controls and the extra PS2 content, which may be a deal breaker depending on how much you do or don't enjoy that sort of thing. In my personal opinion, having the giant aiming reticle on screen at all times is a huge leap backwards, and the general clunkiness of using the Wiimote and nunchuck was hard to get used to. I will say that aiming felt fairly fluid for a Wii game, but hitting the aim button and finding out your cursor is all the way on the other side of the screen means you'll take some cheap hits. Video-wise, there's almost no distinction between the original and this port, which is why I used footage of it in the GameCube section. After this, there was some Android and iOS ports, which really aren't worth discussing, honestly. Fast forward 7 years and we finally got a port that drastically improved on all the others that came before it. The Ultimate HD version available on Steam, PS4, and Xbox One is a huge leap forward with beautiful high-resolution graphics, improved 2D assets, redrawn textures, and the inclusion of all additional content that came in the other ports. It includes mouse and keyboard support, which actually works pretty well, but plugging in your own Xbox or PS4 controller will definitely make the QuickTime events much easier. This version of the game is hands down the best experience you'll have with Resident Evil 4. It has all the added content that has ever existed and doubles the original 30 frames per second for a much smoother experience. It should probably be clear by now, but this is my #1 recommendation for new players. However, if you're looking for that authentic feel, you really can't go wrong upscaling the original or Wii versions either. So after all these ups and downs, I'm sure you're wondering exactly how I feel about RE4. Well, I have two very important but conflicting things to say on the matter.
Oh, you crazy American.
First, this is a ridiculously fun game, Everything you've heard about the revolutionary gameplay, stunning graphics, and action-packed pacing is 100% true, making this one of the very few games that lives up to the public hype. Which brings us to number 2. This is a really bad Resident Evil game.
What are you talking about?
Now, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but this didn't need to be an RE game. It would still be an amazing action game without the RE title. Such a small amount of it even lines up with the series, I'm left wondering, what's the point? Listen guys, this isn't a negative, and I know the fanboy in you is raging right now, but think about it. Is it the 10% of the game tied to the overall series that makes this a fun game for you, or is it the action-packed gameplay? And this isn't hypothetical either, I'm honestly wondering. No matter how you slice it, this is an amazingly fun experience. My only issue is that it would set the standard for RE games from this point on, and in my opinion, it's just not an RE game, plain and simple. And with that, I have prepared myself for the onslaught of disagreements in the comment section, knowing full well I've done this to myself. Well guys, thanks for sticking around, and make sure to tune in for the next video because we may just be going back to the very beginning. But until then, I'll see you guys next time right here on the Resident Evil Retrospective. Hey guys, thanks for sticking around. Real quick, I want to give a huge thanks to all my patrons. You guys keep this show running, and that is legitimately amazing. If you guys are looking to see me cover all the spin-off games in the RE series, maybe think about contributing too. Once I hit my funding goal, I'll cover every game RE ever put its brand on. If you can't or don't want to contribute, don't worry. The fact that you watched all the way to this point is incredible. Seriously, thank all of you. Alright, so enough of that mushy stuff. I'll see you guys right here in the next entry in the Resident Evil Retrospective.